The words hit me like a physical blow as Dr. Richard Pemberton's voice carried across the entire waiting room of his upscale dental practice. "Ms. Martinez, I understand finances can be tight for people in your situation, but dental implants are a significant investment. Perhaps we should discuss more budget-friendly options that would be more realistic for someone with your income level. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you." Every head in the crowded waiting room turned toward me as I sat there in my discount store sweater and worn jeans, holding my library employee ID badge that I'd forgotten to remove from my cardigan. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the soft classical music playing overhead and the uncomfortable shuffling of other patients who were suddenly very interested in their magazines. I could feel the weight of their stares, the mixture of pity and judgment that comes when someone's financial limitations are exposed in public. Dr. Pemberton stood there in his pristine white coat, his perfectly styled silver hair catching the light from the expensive dental office fixtures, looking down at me with the kind of patronizing smile that wealthy professionals reserve for people they consider beneath their social station. Behind him, I could see Ashley Chen, the receptionist, trying to hide her smirk as she pretended to organize appointment cards. The other patients in the waiting room had varying expressions of secondhand embarrassment and superiority, as if they were grateful not to be the person whose financial inadequacy was being discussed like a medical condition. What Dr. Richard Pemberton didn't know as he stood there humiliating me in front of a room full of witnesses was that 3 hours earlier, I had signed the purchase agreement for the Millbrook Professional Plaza, the very building that housed his expensive dental practice. The irony was so perfect it almost made me laugh, except for the burning humiliation that was spreading through my chest like acid. My name is Rebecca Martinez, though most people in Millbrook call me Becca, and for the past 4 years I had carefully cultivated the image of a quiet, financially struggling single woman who worked part-time at the public library and lived modestly in the Riverside Gardens apartment complex. I shopped at discount stores, drove a 12-year-old Honda Civic that I maintained meticulously, and generally kept to myself in ways that allowed people to make assumptions about my circumstances without ever directly lying about my situation. The truth was considerably more complex than my carefully maintained appearance suggested. My grandmother, Elena Martinez, had been one of the most successful commercial real estate investors in Ohio, building a portfolio of properties across 3 counties through decades of shrewd acquisitions and strategic development. When she passed away 2 years ago, she left me not just her considerable wealth, but also her business philosophy that true power came from being underestimated by people who judge success by surface appearances rather than actual capability. Elena had spent her entire career allowing male business partners and competitors to dismiss her as an unimportant widow who happened to inherit some properties, all while systematically outmaneuvering them in deals that expanded her influence and financial position. She taught me that in a world where people made assumptions based on clothing, cars, and addresses, there was tremendous strategic advantage in appearing less successful than you actually were. Following her philosophy, I had continued to live simply while using the inheritance to acquire commercial properties throughout Millbrook and the surrounding area. I held advanced degrees in business administration and real estate development, credentials I'd earned while working at the library and maintaining my modest lifestyle. My investments were managed through a limited liability company that kept my personal involvement discreet, allowing me to continue living as Becca the librarian, while building a commercial real estate portfolio that would have impressed even my grandmother. The Millbrook Professional Plaza had been my target acquisition for over a year. The building housed Dr. Pemberton's dental practice along with several other professional offices, and its location in the heart of Millbrook's downtown business district made it an invaluable anchor property for my growing portfolio. The previous owner had been motivated to sell quickly due to personal financial pressures, and after months of careful negotiation through my property management company, we had reached terms that gave me control of one of the most prestigious commercial buildings in town. Dr. Pemberton, of course, knew nothing about any of this. To him, I was simply the quiet woman who worked at the library, lived in a modest apartment, and apparently couldn't afford the dental treatment he was recommending. His assessment wasn't entirely unreasonable, based on the information he had available. My library position was legitimate, though it was more of a personal interest than a financial necessity. I genuinely enjoyed helping people find information and resources, and the work kept me connected to the community in ways that pure real estate investment couldn't provide. The dental visit that led to this moment of public humiliation had begun 3 weeks earlier, when I'd chipped a molar eating popcorn during a movie night at home. The chip wasn't painful, but it was noticeable enough that I knew it needed professional attention. Dr. Pemberton's practice was the most highly regarded dental office in Millbrook, with a reputation for quality work and state-of-the-art equipment that attracted patients from surrounding communities. I had made the appointment using my real name and providing my library employment information when asked about my occupation, as I always did. There was no reason to elaborate on my additional income sources or property investments when filling out routine dental paperwork. The office had my insurance information, which was a standard plan provided through the library's benefits package, and that seemed sufficient for scheduling basic dental care. The initial consultation had gone smoothly enough. Dr. Pemberton had examined the chipped tooth and explained that while a simple filling might provide temporary repair, the extent of the damage made a crown the more durable long-term solution. The cost would be substantial, but it was well within my means, and I had agreed to proceed with the treatment he recommended. The problems began when Dr. Pemberton's examination revealed additional issues that he claimed required immediate attention. According to his assessment, I had 2 other teeth that needed crowns, and one that required extraction and replacement with an implant. The recommended treatment plan suddenly expanded from a single crown to a comprehensive dental restoration that would cost nearly $15,000. I had asked for time to consider the expanded treatment plan, partly because the sudden escalation felt aggressive, and partly because I wanted to research whether all the recommended procedures were actually necessary. Dr. Pemberton had seemed irritated by my request for a second opinion, suggesting that delaying treatment would only make the problems worse and more expensive to address. During that conversation, I noticed his attitude toward me shift in subtle but unmistakable ways. When I mentioned wanting to think about the financial commitment, he had looked at me with the kind of expression people use when they're trying to be patient with someone who doesn't understand important concepts. His tone became more condescending, and he began explaining dental procedures in overly simplified terms, as if my request for time to consider reflected intellectual limitations rather than prudent financial planning. Ashley Chen, the receptionist, had been equally dismissive when I called to schedule today's follow-up appointment. She had mentioned that Dr. Pemberton was prepared to discuss payment plans and financing options that would make the treatment more manageable for someone in my situation. The phrase, "someone in my situation," had been delivered with the kind of professional sympathy that barely concealed judgment about my financial circumstances. I had arrived at today's appointment, prepared to decline most of the recommended treatment and proceed only with the original crown that I actually needed. My research had suggested that while the additional procedures might be beneficial, they weren't immediately necessary, and I preferred to address dental issues gradually rather than committing to extensive work all at once. Dr. Pemberton had clearly been expecting me to accept his payment plan proposals and proceed with the full treatment recommendation. When I explained that I preferred to limit today's treatment to the original crown, his professional demeanor had shifted into something much colder and more dismissive. That's when he had delivered his assessment of my financial limitations loud enough for the entire waiting room to hear. His comment about people in my situation and the need for budget-friendly options had been calculated to embarrass me into accepting his more expensive treatment recommendations. The public humiliation was intended to pressure me into agreeing to procedures I didn't want, by making my financial concerns seem unreasonable and embarrassing. The strategy might have worked on someone who actually depended on part-time library income and couldn't afford unexpected medical expenses. For someone who had spent the morning finalizing the purchase of the building where this conversation was taking place, the experience was humiliating in entirely different ways. I could see the other patients in the waiting room making assumptions about my circumstances based on Dr. Pemberton's loud assessment of my financial limitations. Maria Santos, the dental hygienist who had always been friendly during previous visits, was looking at me with obvious pity. Kevin Rodriguez, the practice manager, was studying his computer screen with the kind of intense focus people use when they're trying to avoid witnessing someone else's embarrassment. The patients waiting for their appointments were having various reactions to the public discussion of my supposed financial inadequacy. An elderly man in an expensive suit was shaking his head with disapproval, though whether he was criticizing Dr. Pemberton's unprofessional behavior or my apparent inability to afford proper dental care was unclear. A middle-aged woman with perfectly styled hair and designer jewelry was whispering to her teenage daughter, probably using my situation as an example of why education and career planning were important. What made the humiliation even more acute was that I genuinely couldn't defend myself without revealing information about my actual financial situation that I preferred to keep private. Explaining that I could easily afford the recommended treatment but chose not to proceed would require discussing my real estate investments and inherited wealth, information that would fundamentally change how people in Millbrook viewed and treated me. I had spent 4 years carefully maintaining my modest lifestyle specifically to avoid the kind of attention and changed relationships that came with known wealth. People treated you differently when they knew you had money, and not always in ways that were positive or genuine. My grandmother had taught me that being underestimated was often more valuable than being respected, because underestimation created opportunities that respect couldn't provide. But sitting in that waiting room while Dr. Pemberton explained my financial limitations to an audience of strangers, I was beginning to question whether the strategic advantages of being underestimated were worth the personal cost of allowing people to treat me with dismissive condescension. Dr. Pemberton was continuing his explanation of budget-friendly alternatives, with the kind of detailed patience that teachers use with struggling students. He suggested that I could address the chipped tooth with a less expensive filling that would provide adequate function even if it wasn't as aesthetically pleasing as a crown. The other dental issues could be monitored over time and addressed when my financial situation improved enough to afford proper treatment. His tone suggested that he was being generous and understanding rather than publicly humiliating someone based on assumptions about their economic circumstances. Ashley Chen was nodding along supportively, as if Dr. Pemberton was demonstrating admirable compassion for patients who faced financial hardships. The irony of the situation was becoming almost surreal. Dr. Pemberton was preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story, explaining why I couldn't afford dental treatment while standing in a building that I had purchased that morning. His expensive dental practice operated under a lease agreement that was now ultimately controlled by me, though the property management company that handled my investments meant he would never know about my ownership unless I chose to reveal it. I had purchased the Millbrook Professional Plaza not just as an investment, but as part of a larger strategy to acquire key commercial properties in downtown Millbrook that would give me significant influence over the area's business development. The building housing Dr. Pemberton's practice was strategically located near the courthouse, city hall, and several other professional services, making it a cornerstone property for anyone interested in commercial real estate development in the area. The purchase had required months of careful negotiation and due diligence, processes that had given me detailed insight into the financial health of the businesses operating in the building. Dr. Pemberton's dental practice, despite its upscale appearance and expensive equipment, was actually struggling with cash flow problems that were reflected in consistently late rent payments and requests for lease modifications that would reduce his monthly obligations. The previous building owner had mentioned Dr. Pemberton's financial difficulties during our negotiations, noting that the dental practice's lease was up for renewal within the next year, and that finding a replacement tenant with similar creditworthiness might be challenging given the specialized nature of the dental office space. This information had influenced my purchase decision, as buildings with stable long-term tenants were generally more valuable than those with potential vacancy issues. Dr. Pemberton's financial problems meant that I would likely need to address his lease situation soon after taking ownership, either by negotiating new terms that he could actually afford, or by finding alternative tenants for the space. The cruel irony was that Dr. Pemberton was publicly questioning my ability to afford dental treatment, while his own business was behind on rent payments to the building that I now owned. His assumption about my financial limitations was not just wrong, but perfectly backwards. I was in a position to determine whether his business could continue operating in its current location, while he was making patronizing suggestions about budget-friendly dental options. As Dr. Pemberton concluded his explanation of financial alternatives, I realized that this moment represented a turning point in how I wanted to handle my carefully maintained modest lifestyle. The strategic advantages of being underestimated had served me well in business negotiations and property acquisitions, but they came with personal costs that were becoming increasingly difficult to accept. Being treated with condescending sympathy because people assumed I was financially struggling was affecting my self-respect in ways that I hadn't fully anticipated. My grandmother had been strong enough to endure decades of being underestimated and dismissed, but she had also lived in a different era where women had fewer options for commanding respect and recognition. I had choices that my grandmother hadn't possessed, including the choice to reveal my actual circumstances and demand the respect that my achievements and capabilities warranted. The question was whether I was ready to give up the strategic advantages of anonymity in exchange for the personal satisfaction of being treated according to my actual status rather than my apparent circumstances. Dr. Pemberton was waiting for my response to his suggestions about budget-friendly treatment options, clearly expecting me to express gratitude for his understanding and flexibility regarding my financial limitations. Ashley Chen had prepared paperwork for a modified treatment plan that would address only the most essential immediate needs, while deferring more expensive procedures until I could afford them. The other patients in the waiting room were witnessing what they assumed was a generous professional accommodating a patient's financial constraints, a narrative that cast Dr. Pemberton as compassionate and understanding rather than condescending and presumptuous. I looked around the waiting room at immediate needs while deferring more expensive procedures until I could afford them. The other patients in the waiting room were witnessing what they assumed was a generous professional accommodating a patient's financial constraints, a narrative that cast Dr. Pemberton as compassionate and understanding rather than condescending and presumptuous. I looked around the waiting room at the faces of people who had just heard my financial limitations discussed like a medical condition, seeing mixtures of pity, superiority, and secondhand embarrassment. Then I looked at Dr. Pemberton, who was standing there in his expensive white coat in a building that I had purchased that morning, waiting for me to thank him for his generous accommodation of my poverty. The decision I made in that moment would change everything, not just for me, but for Dr. Pemberton and everyone else who had witnessed this humiliating encounter. I was about to discover that there were consequences for making assumptions about people based on appearances, and that underestimating someone could be the most expensive mistake you ever made. But first, I needed to process what had just happened, and decide how I wanted to respond to being publicly humiliated by someone whose rent I was now responsible for collecting. The strategic part of my mind was already calculating possibilities and consequences, while the emotional part was dealing with anger and humiliation that I had never experienced quite so acutely. The next few moments would determine whether I continued to accept being treated as someone whose financial limitations required sympathetic accommodation, or whether it was time for Dr. Richard Pemberton to learn that appearances could be very deceiving, and that assumptions about people's circumstances could have consequences he had never imagined. As I sat there in that expensive dental office, surrounded by witnesses to my public humiliation, holding the keys to the building in my purse, I realized that my grandmother's lessons about the power of being underestimated were about to be tested in ways neither of us had ever anticipated. The question was whether I was ready to reveal who I really was and what I was actually capable of achieving, or whether I would continue to let people like Dr. Pemberton treat me as someone whose financial circumstances required their patronizing sympathy. Either way, this moment in the dental office waiting room would be remembered as the day that everything changed. Though Dr. Pemberton had no idea how dramatically his assumptions about my financial situation were about to alter his own circumstances. The story that was about to unfold would teach everyone involved that judging people by their appearances was not just wrong, but potentially catastrophic for those who built their professional relationships on condescending assumptions about other people's worth and capabilities. Dr. Pemberton was about to learn that the quiet woman from the library was much more than she appeared to be, and that underestimating someone could be the most expensive lesson he ever received. I stood up slowly from the waiting room chair, my legs feeling unsteady as the full weight of what had just occurred settled into my consciousness. Dr. Pemberton was still standing there with his clipboard, waiting for my grateful acceptance of his generous accommodation for my apparent poverty, completely oblivious to the fact that his condescending charity was being offered to the person who now controlled his business location. The silence in the waiting room had become oppressive, with every patient and staff member waiting to see how I would respond to this public discussion of my financial inadequacy. I could feel their collective attention like a physical pressure, their assumptions about my circumstances crystallizing into a narrative that would follow me through every future interaction in this small town. That's when something fundamental shifted inside me. The humiliation that had been burning in my chest transformed into something much colder and more focused. This wasn't just about a dentist making assumptions about my finances. This was about 4 years of allowing people to treat me with dismissive condescension because I had chosen to appear less successful than I actually was. My grandmother Elena had endured decades of being underestimated because she lived in an era when women had limited options for commanding respect in business environments. But I lived in a different world, with different choices, and I was suddenly tired of accepting treatment that I had the power to change. The revelation hit me with startling clarity. Dr. Pemberton's public humiliation wasn't an unfortunate misunderstanding that I needed to endure gracefully. It was a calculated attempt to pressure me into accepting expensive dental work by making my financial concerns seem unreasonable and embarrassing. He had deliberately chosen to shame me in front of witnesses because he assumed I had no power to respond effectively. I looked at Dr. Pemberton standing there in his expensive white coat, radiating the kind of professional authority that came from years of being the most important person in any room he entered. His dental practice was designed to intimidate patients into accepting his recommendations through displays of wealth and status that suggested his judgment was beyond question. The waiting room itself was a carefully orchestrated performance of success and superiority. Original artwork hung on walls, painted in soothing but expensive colors. The furniture was modern and costly, chosen to communicate that this was a practice for successful people who could afford the best. Every detail was calculated to make patients feel that questioning Dr. Pemberton's recommendations would be inappropriate and presumptuous. But I was seeing the performance differently now, understanding it as a manipulation tactic rather than evidence of professional competence. Dr. Pemberton's expensive office was funded by patients who were intimidated into accepting unnecessary procedures because they didn't want to appear unable to afford quality dental care. Ashley Chen was still holding the modified treatment plan paperwork, clearly expecting me to sign documents that would confirm my acceptance of charity dental care appropriate for someone in my reduced circumstances. Her expression carried the kind of professional sympathy that service workers use when dealing with customers who can't afford premium options. The other patients in the waiting room were beginning to lose interest in my situation, having witnessed what they assumed was a routine accommodation for financial hardship. They were returning to their magazines and phones, satisfied that the awkward moment had been resolved through Dr. Pemberton's generous flexibility. I realized that if I simply accepted the modified treatment plan and left quietly, this incident would be forgotten by everyone except me. Dr. Pemberton would continue operating his practice with the same condescending attitudes toward patients he perceived as financially inferior. Ashley Chen would continue treating people differently based on assumptions about their economic circumstances. The patients who had witnessed my humiliation would remember it as an example of why maintaining financial success was important for maintaining dignity. The strategic part of my mind was calculating the costs and benefits of different responses. I could maintain my carefully constructed, modest lifestyle and continue benefiting from being underestimated in business situations. The humiliation I had just experienced would be a small price to pay for the strategic advantages that anonymity provided in commercial real estate negotiations. Alternatively, I could reveal my actual circumstances and demand the respect that my achievements warranted. This would eliminate the personal costs of being treated with condescending sympathy, but it would also end the strategic advantages that had served me well in property acquisitions and business negotiations. But there was a third option that I hadn't considered before this moment. I could use this situation to teach Dr. Pemberton and everyone else involved that making assumptions about people based on appearances could have consequences they never imagined. My phone buzzed in my purse with a text message, and I glanced at it reflexively. The message was from Jennifer Thompson, my real estate attorney, and one of the few people in Millbrook who knew the full extent of my property investments. Jennifer had handled the legal aspects of the Millbrook Professional Plaza purchase, and her text was a routine update about the closing process. Purchase completed successfully. Keys and building management information transferred. Congratulations on owning downtown Millbrook's most prestigious commercial property. Ready to discuss tenant relations whenever you are. Reading Jennifer's message while standing in Dr. Pemberton's waiting room created a cognitive dissonance so intense it was almost amusing. The contrast between being treated as someone who couldn't afford dental care and receiving congratulations for purchasing a prestigious commercial building was surreal enough to break through the humiliation and activate a different kind of emotional response. I looked up from my phone to find Dr. Pemberton still waiting for my response to his generous offer of budget-friendly dental alternatives. His expression had shifted from patronizing patience to mild irritation, as if my delay in accepting his charity was inconsiderate of his valuable time. That's when I made the decision that would change everything for everyone involved in this situation. Instead of accepting the modified treatment plan or explaining my actual financial circumstances, I was going to demonstrate that assumptions about people's capabilities could be dangerous and expensive mistakes. I smiled at Dr. Pemberton with the same kind of professional courtesy he had been showing me, though my smile carried undertones that he was too arrogant to recognize. Dr. Pemberton, I appreciate your concern about my financial situation, but I think there might be some misunderstandings that we should clarify. My tone was calm and measured, but something in my voice made Ashley Chen look up from her paperwork with sudden attention. Maria Santos paused in her movement between treatment rooms, and Kevin Rodriguez glanced over from his computer screen with an expression that suggested he was picking up on subtle cues that Dr. Pemberton was missing entirely. I don't think I've been entirely clear about my circumstances, I continued, reaching into my purse for my phone. Before we proceed with any treatment decisions, I should probably make a phone call to discuss some recent developments that might affect our conversation. Dr. Pemberton's expression shifted from irritation to confusion. He clearly hadn't expected me to respond to his generous accommodation with anything other than grateful acceptance. The suggestion that I needed to make a phone call about recent developments didn't fit the narrative he had constructed about my financial limitations. Ms. Martinez, I'm not sure what kind of developments would change the basic financial realities we've been discussing, Dr. Pemberton said, his tone carrying the kind of patience that adults use with children who are trying to delay unpleasant decisions. The cost of dental treatment doesn't change based on phone calls. I could see the other patients in the waiting room becoming interested in our conversation again, sensing that something unexpected was happening. The elderly man in the expensive suit was watching our interaction with the kind of attention people pay to situations that might become entertaining. You're absolutely right that dental costs don't change, I agreed, maintaining my polite smile. But other circumstances can change quite dramatically, sometimes in ways that affect how people view financial priorities and professional relationships. I scrolled through my contacts until I found Jennifer's number, then looked back at Dr. Pemberton with an expression that was becoming less accommodating and more businesslike. I hope you don't mind if I make this call in your waiting room. The conversation might be relevant to our discussion about treatment options. Ashley Chen was clearly becoming uncomfortable with the direction our conversation was taking. She had prepared paperwork for a straightforward resolution where I would accept modified treatment and express gratitude for Dr. Pemberton's understanding. This unexpected development was disrupting the script she had anticipated. Dr. Pemberton was beginning to show signs of irritation that went beyond mild impatience. His practice operated on efficient scheduling that maximized the number of patients he could process each day. Extended conversations about financial circumstances were cutting into his productive time and potentially affecting his ability to stay on schedule. Ms. Martinez, I'm not sure what kind of phone call is necessary to discuss basic dental treatment options, he said, his voice carrying an edge that hadn't been present during his earlier sympathetic explanations of my financial limitations. Perhaps we could schedule another appointment if you need time to consider the modified treatment plan we've discussed. I could see that Dr. Pemberton was trying to end our conversation in a way that would allow him to move on to more profitable patients who didn't require extended discussions about financial accommodations. His suggestion of rescheduling was a polite way of dismissing me so he could focus on patients who represented better business opportunities. But I was no longer interested in making Dr. Pemberton's day more convenient or profitable. The humiliation he had inflicted on me in front of witnesses had been deliberate and unnecessary, and I was beginning to understand that strategic responses to arrogant behavior could be more satisfying than simply enduring it gracefully. Actually, Dr. Pemberton, I think this phone call might save us both time by clarifying some misconceptions that seem to be affecting our communication, I said, pressing Jennifer's number and holding the phone to my ear. I promise the conversation will be brief and directly relevant to our discussion. Jennifer answered on the second ring, her voice carrying the professional warmth that made her one of the most successful real estate attorneys in the region. Becca. Perfect timing. I was just reviewing the final documentation for the Millbrook Professional Plaza purchase. Everything went through smoothly, and you're now the official owner of downtown Millbrook's premier commercial building. I had called Jennifer intending to have a brief conversation that would demonstrate my actual financial circumstances without directly revealing sensitive information. But hearing her congratulations while standing in Dr. Pemberton's waiting room created an opportunity for a more dramatic revelation than I had originally planned. "That's wonderful news, Jennifer," I said, speaking clearly enough that everyone in the waiting room could hear my side of the conversation. "I know the Millbrook Professional Plaza has been a target acquisition for over a year. The location and tenant mix make it such a valuable commercial property." I could see Dr. Pemberton's expression beginning to change as he processed the implications of my conversation. Ashley Chen had stopped pretending to organize appointment cards and was listening with obvious interest. The patients in the waiting room were paying attention with the kind of focus people give to unexpected entertainment. "I'm particularly interested in reviewing the tenant lease agreements," I continued, watching Dr. Pemberton's face carefully. "I understand there have been some challenges with rental payments and lease compliance that will need to be addressed now that I'm taking over building management." Jennifer's response was enthusiastic and detailed, providing information about the building's financial performance and tenant relationships that I already knew, but that served my current purposes perfectly. The previous owner mentioned that Pemberton Family Dentistry has been struggling with timely rent payments. Their lease is up for renewal next year, so you'll need to decide whether to offer new terms or find alternative tenants for that space. The silence in the waiting room had become absolute. Dr. Pemberton was staring at me with an expression that mixed disbelief with growing alarm. Ashley Chen had gone completely still, clearly understanding that the financial dynamic in the room had shifted in ways that no one had anticipated. I continued my conversation with Jennifer, asking questions about property management and tenant relations that demonstrated my familiarity with commercial real estate operations. The discussion revealed not just that I had purchased an expensive building, but that I understood the business complexities involved in managing commercial properties and dealing with problematic tenants. "Yes, I'll definitely want to review the rent collection records and lease compliance issues for all tenants," I said, making direct eye contact with Dr. Pemberton. "It's important to establish clear expectations about financial obligations and professional conduct from the beginning of any new ownership relationship." When I ended the call, the waiting room remained silent except for the classical music that now seemed inappropriately cheerful for the tension that had developed. Dr. Pemberton was looking at me as if he had never seen me before, trying to reconcile the modest woman he had been offering charity dental care with someone who apparently owned commercial real estate in downtown Millbrook. "Ms. Martinez," he said slowly, his voice carrying uncertainty that hadn't been present during his earlier confident assessments of my financial limitations. "I may have misunderstood some aspects of your situation." I smiled at him with the same professional courtesy he had shown me, though the power dynamic in our interaction had fundamentally shifted. "It seems that way, doesn't it? Sometimes appearances can be deceiving, and assumptions about people's circumstances can lead to misunderstandings." Ashley Chen was looking between Dr. Pemberton and me with obvious confusion, trying to understand how the narrative had changed so dramatically. The patients in the waiting room were watching our interaction with the kind of fascination people show for unexpected plot developments in familiar stories. Dr. Pemberton was clearly struggling to process information that contradicted everything he had assumed about my financial situation. The confident authority he had displayed while explaining my limitations had been replaced by uncertainty about how to proceed with someone whose economic circumstances were apparently very different from what he had believed. "I apologize if there was any confusion about your financial capabilities," he said, his tone becoming more formal and respectful. "Perhaps we should reconsider the original treatment plan that we discussed during your initial consultation." I could see that Dr. Pemberton was attempting to recover from his error by returning to professional courtesy and acting as if his public assessment of my poverty had been a simple misunderstanding, rather than a deliberate attempt to shame me into accepting his recommendations. But I wasn't interested in allowing him to pretend that his behavior had been an innocent mistake. The humiliation he had inflicted on me in front of witnesses had been calculated and unnecessary, and I wanted him to understand that such behavior could have consequences he hadn't anticipated. Dr. Pemberton, I think the confusion goes beyond simple misunderstandings about financial capabilities, I said, maintaining my polite tone while making it clear that I wasn't going to accept a superficial apology as resolution for his conduct. Your assessment of my situation was based on assumptions about people who work at libraries and live in modest apartments. I could see him beginning to understand that this conversation wasn't going to end with a simple return to normal professional relations. The respectful distance he was now showing me suggested that he was starting to grasp that he had made a serious error in judgment, though he probably didn't yet understand the full extent of the consequences his behavior might have. More importantly, I continued, your decision to discuss my supposed financial limitations in front of your entire waiting room suggests a pattern of professional conduct that raises questions about how you treat patients who you perceive as economically disadvantaged. Dr. Pemberton's expression was becoming increasingly uncomfortable as he realized that his attempt to pressure me through public humiliation had backfired in ways he was only beginning to understand. The other patients in the waiting room were witnessing his discomfort with the same attention they had given to my earlier embarrassment. Ashley Chen was clearly realizing that the situation had developed beyond anything she was equipped to handle. Kevin Rodriguez was watching our interaction with the kind of focused attention that people give to conversations that might have significant consequences for their workplace. Ms. Martinez, I sincerely apologize if my comments about treatment options seemed inappropriate, Dr. Pemberton said, his voice carrying genuine concern that went beyond polite professional courtesy. I was simply trying to be helpful in discussing alternatives that might be more manageable. I could see that he was beginning to understand that his behavior hadn't just been rude, but potentially damaging to his professional reputation and business relationships. The apology he was offering suggested that he was starting to grasp the seriousness of his error, though he still didn't understand the full scope of the power dynamic that had shifted in our interaction. But I wasn't finished. Demonstrating that assumptions about people's circumstances could be expensive mistakes. Dr. Pemberton's humiliation of me had been public and deliberate, and I wanted him to understand that such behavior could have consequences that extended far beyond hurt feelings. My phone buzzed again with another message from Jennifer, and I glanced at it with the same casual attention I had shown to her previous text. This message contained information that would make the next phase of our conversation even more interesting than Dr. Pemberton could possibly imagine. Building inspection completed. Several code violations noted in dental office space requiring immediate attention. Previous owner deferred maintenance issues, now your responsibility as new landlord. Recommend discussing compliance timeline with tenant. I looked up from my phone to find Dr. Pemberton still waiting for my response to his apology, clearly hoping that acknowledging his error would allow us to return to normal professional relations and proceed with dental treatment as if nothing significant had happened. But the message from Jennifer had provided me with information that would make this conversation much more educational for everyone involved. Dr. Pemberton was about to learn that treating people with condescending assumptions could create complications that extended far beyond uncomfortable social situations. I smiled at him with the same polite professionalism he had shown me, though my expression now carried implications that he was beginning to recognize as potentially problematic for his business operations. Dr. Pemberton, your apology is noted, but I think we have more substantial issues to discuss than treatment options, I said, my tone remaining courteous while becoming unmistakably businesslike. It seems that your lease situation and building code compliance are going to require our immediate attention. The confusion on his face was almost comical, as he tried to understand how our conversation about dental treatment had suddenly shifted to discussions about leases and building codes. Ashley Chen was looking increasingly worried, clearly sensing that something significant was happening but not understanding what it was. I'm not sure what you mean about lease situations, Dr. Pemberton said, though his voice carried growing unease that suggested he was beginning to suspect where this conversation might be leading. I reached into my purse and extracted the keyring that Jennifer had given me that morning, holding it up so that Dr. Pemberton could see the distinctive building management tags that identified access to the Millbrook Professional Plaza. The keys represented not just property ownership, but control over his business location and operational future. Dr. Pemberton, I believe we need to have a very different conversation about professional conduct, tenant relations, and the expectations that come with new building ownership, I said, watching his expression change as he began to understand the true scope of what had just occurred. The waiting room had become completely silent, as everyone present realized that they were witnessing something much more significant than a routine dental appointment. Ashley Chen looked genuinely frightened. Kevin Rodriguez appeared to be calculating potential implications for his employment, and the patients were watching with the kind of fascination reserved for dramatic reversals of fortune. Dr. Pemberton was staring at the keys in my hand with growing alarm, finally beginning to comprehend that the modest woman he had publicly humiliated for her supposed financial limitations was actually in a position to determine whether his expensive dental practice could continue operating in its current location. The power dynamic that had seemed so clear when he was explaining my financial limitations to a waiting room full of witnesses had not just shifted, but completely reversed. I was no longer the financially struggling patient who needed his charitable accommodation. I was his landlord, and he was the tenant with a history of late rent payments and lease compliance issues. The next few minutes would determine whether Dr. Pemberton learned anything meaningful from this experience, about the dangers of making assumptions about people based on appearances, or whether he would simply try to minimize the damage from his error without understanding the broader lessons about respect and professional conduct. Either way, this conversation was about to become much more educational for everyone involved than a routine discussion about dental treatment options. The silence in the waiting room stretched endlessly as Dr. Pemberton stared at the building keys in my hand, his face cycling through expressions of disbelief, confusion, and growing dread. Ashley Chen had gone completely pale, her hands frozen over the appointment book as she processed the implications of what she was witnessing. Kevin Rodriguez had stopped all pretense of working and was openly staring at our interaction with the kind of focused attention people give to car accidents. I could see the exact moment when the full reality hit Dr. Pemberton. His carefully maintained professional composure cracked, revealing something much uglier underneath. The patronizing sympathy he had shown when discussing my supposed financial limitations was replaced by naked fear and anger. He was beginning to understand that his public humiliation of someone he perceived as powerless had backfired catastrophically. "You can't be serious," he said, his voice tight with desperation that he was trying to disguise as professional skepticism. "You work part-time at the library. You drive an old Honda. There's no way you could afford to purchase this building." His tone carried the kind of desperate certainty that people use when confronted with information that threatens their fundamental assumptions about how the world works. Dr. Pemberton had built his entire professional identity around being the most successful and powerful person in any room he entered. The possibility that he had just publicly humiliated his own landlord was challenging his understanding of social hierarchies in ways that he couldn't easily process. I smiled at him with the same patient understanding he had shown me when explaining my financial limitations, though my expression now carried undertones that made Ashley Chen visibly flinch. "Dr. Pemberton, I think your confusion demonstrates exactly the kind of assumptions that led to our current situation. You've made judgments about my circumstances based on limited information and surface appearances." I reached into my purse and extracted my phone again, scrolling to the email folder where I kept documentation related to my property investments. The Millbrook Professional Plaza purchase had generated extensive paperwork, and I had digital copies of every significant document related to the transaction. "Perhaps I should clarify some details about my actual circumstances," I continued, holding up my phone so that Dr. Pemberton could see the screen displaying official purchase documents with my name clearly visible as the buyer. "These are the closing documents for the Millbrook Professional Plaza, completed this morning through Martinez Property Holdings, LLC." Dr. Pemberton leaned forward to examine the screen, his expression shifting from skepticism to alarm as he recognized the official letterhead and legal language of commercial real estate transactions. Ashley Chen was trying to see the documents from her position behind the reception desk, clearly understanding that whatever was displayed on my phone was significant enough to completely change the dynamic of our conversation. "Martinez Property Holdings has been acquiring commercial real estate throughout Millbrook for the past 3 years," I explained, my tone remaining conversational while delivering information that was systematically destroying Dr. Pemberton's understanding of who he was dealing with. This building was a particularly attractive acquisition because of its strategic location and established tenant base. I could see the patients in the waiting room straining to hear our conversation, clearly recognizing that they were witnessing something much more dramatic than a routine dental appointment. The elderly man in the expensive suit was watching with undisguised fascination, and the middle-aged woman with designer jewelry was whispering urgently to her teenage daughter. Though I should mention, I continued, scrolling to another section of my email, the previous owner did provide some concerning information about tenant payment histories and lease compliance issues that will need to be addressed under new management. Dr. Pemberton's face had gone white as he began to understand the implications of what I was revealing. His expensive dental practice operated under a lease agreement that was now controlled by someone he had just publicly humiliated for her supposed financial inadequacy. The power dynamic he had assumed when offering me charity dental care had not just reversed, but completely inverted. Ashley Chen was clearly panicking, understanding that her employer's business relationship with the building owner had been permanently damaged by the scene she had just witnessed. Kevin Rodriguez was staring at his computer screen with the kind of intense focus people use when they're trying to become invisible during workplace disasters. "I don't understand," Dr. Pemberton said, though his voice suggested that he was beginning to understand all too well. "If you have the resources to purchase commercial real estate, why are you working at the library? Why do you live in Riverside Gardens? Why do you drive an old car?" His questions revealed the depth of his confusion about people who didn't display their wealth in ways that he considered appropriate. Dr. Pemberton had built his identity around conspicuous consumption and status symbols that announced his success to everyone around him. The concept that someone might choose to live modestly despite having significant financial resources was apparently beyond his comprehension. "Dr. Pemberton, those are excellent questions that reveal some interesting assumptions about how successful people should behave," I replied, my tone carrying the same educational patience he had used when explaining my financial limitations. "Perhaps we should explore why you believe that wealth must be displayed through expensive cars and luxury lifestyles." I could see him struggling to process information that challenged his fundamental beliefs about money, success, and social status. His practice was designed around projecting wealth and authority to intimidate patients into accepting expensive treatments. The idea that genuine financial power might operate quietly and without ostentation was threatening his entire business model. "More importantly," I continued, "your question suggests that you believe people's financial circumstances justify different levels of professional respect and courtesy. That's a perspective that could create significant problems in landlord-tenant relationships." Dr. Pemberton was beginning to show signs of genuine panic, as he realized that his professional future might depend on maintaining good relations with someone he had just treated with public condescension. His expensive dental practice required the kind of prestigious location that the Millbrook Professional Plaza provided, and alternative spaces in downtown Millbrook were limited and expensive. "Ms. Martinez, I apologize if there were any misunderstandings about your circumstances," he said, his voice carrying desperate sincerity that hadn't been present during his earlier patronizing explanations. "I was simply trying to be helpful in discussing treatment options that might be appropriate." I could see that he was attempting to reframe his behavior as a well-intentioned misunderstanding, rather than acknowledging that he had deliberately tried to shame me into accepting his recommendations. His apology was focused on managing the immediate consequences of his error, rather than understanding why his conduct had been problematic. "Dr. Pemberton, I don't think this was a misunderstanding," I replied, my tone remaining polite while making it clear that I wasn't going to accept superficial explanations for his behavior. "You made a calculated decision to discuss my supposed financial limitations in front of your entire waiting room, because you thought public embarrassment would pressure me into accepting treatments I had declined." Ashley Chen was looking increasingly distressed as she realized that her employer's conduct was being systematically dismantled by someone who now controlled their business location. The patients in the waiting room were watching our interaction with the kind of fascination people show for dramatic reversals of fortune. That assessment suggests a pattern of professional conduct that treats patients differently based on your perceptions of their economic status, I continued. It raises questions about how you interact with other patients who you believe lack the resources to afford your premium treatments. Dr. Pemberton's expression was shifting from panic to anger as he began to understand that I wasn't going to allow him to minimize the significance of his behavior through simple apologies. His professional identity was built around being treated with deference and respect by patients who accepted his authority without question. "Ms. Martinez, I think you're overreacting to a simple communication issue," he said, his voice carrying an edge of irritation that revealed his true attitude toward being challenged by someone he still couldn't accept as his social equal. Dental practices deal with financial considerations every day, and discussing payment options is standard professional conduct. I could see the exact moment when Dr. Pemberton's anger overwhelmed his strategic thinking. Instead of continuing to apologize and attempt damage control, he was reverting to the condescending authority that he was accustomed to using with people who questioned his judgment. There's nothing inappropriate about helping patients understand their financial limitations and explore alternatives that fit their budgets, he continued, his tone becoming more defensive and hostile. If you're embarrassed about needing payment accommodations, that's not my responsibility. Ashley Chen was staring at Dr. Pemberton with horror, clearly understanding that he was making his situation dramatically worse by continuing to argue with someone who now controlled his lease agreement. Kevin Rodriguez had begun quietly gathering papers from his desk, apparently preparing for potential workplace disruption. Dr. Pemberton, your response is quite revealing, I said, maintaining my calm tone while internally celebrating his decision to demonstrate his true character in front of witnesses. You're suggesting that patients who can't afford expensive treatments should expect to have their financial circumstances discussed publicly as a form of professional education. My phone buzzed with another message from Jennifer, and I glanced at it with the same casual attention I had shown to her previous communications. The timing was perfect for the next phase of this educational experience. Building inspection report forwarded to your email. Multiple code violations in dental office space, including electrical systems, ventilation and accessibility compliance. Previous owner avoided enforcement through personal relationships with inspector. New ownership requires immediate attention to violations or space cannot remain certified for medical use. I looked up from my phone to find Dr. Pemberton still waiting for my response to his defensive justification of his conduct, clearly hoping that his explanation would allow us to return to normal professional relations despite the fundamental shift in our power dynamic. Dr. Pemberton, it seems we have additional issues to discuss beyond payment accommodations and professional courtesy, I said, holding up my phone so he could see that I had received another message related to building management. My property manager has just forwarded the building inspection report that was completed as part of the purchase process. The color drained from Dr. Pemberton's face as he began to understand that his problems were extending beyond damaged relationships into potential regulatory and compliance issues. Ashley Chen was looking genuinely frightened, clearly understanding that building code violations could affect their ability to operate the dental practice. The inspection identified several code violations in your office space that require immediate attention, I continued, my tone remaining businesslike while delivering information that was systematically dismantling Dr. Pemberton's professional security. Electrical systems, ventilation, and accessibility compliance all need to be addressed before the space can maintain its certification for medical use. Dr. Pemberton was staring at me with growing desperation, finally beginning to comprehend the full scope of the crisis that his arrogant behavior had created. His expensive dental practice was not just under new management, but potentially facing regulatory issues that could force closure if not addressed quickly and expensively. The previous building owner apparently avoided enforcement through personal relationships with the inspector, I explained, watching Dr. Pemberton's expression become increasingly alarmed. New ownership means those arrangements are no longer valid, and all violations must be corrected according to current building codes. Ashley Chen was clearly calculating the potential costs of building code compliance, and understanding that such expenses could create serious financial problems for a practice that was already struggling with rent payments. Kevin Rodriguez was watching our conversation with the kind of focused attention people give to situations that might affect their employment security. Ms. Martinez, surely we can discuss these issues in a reasonable manner, Dr. Pemberton said, his voice carrying desperation that he was trying to disguise as professional courtesy. Building code compliance is a normal part of commercial property management. I could see that he was attempting to regain control of our conversation by suggesting that regulatory compliance was a routine matter that could be handled through normal landlord-tenant negotiations. His tone implied that I should be grateful for his willingness to work with me on technical issues despite my earlier overreaction to simple communication problems. Dr. Pemberton, you're absolutely right that building code compliance is routine. I agreed, my smile becoming slightly sharper as I prepared to deliver information that would make his situation even more precarious. What makes this situation unusual is the combination of regulatory violations, lease compliance issues, and concerns about professional conduct that affect tenant relations. I scrolled through my email to another message from Jennifer that contained detailed information about Dr. Pemberton's rent payment history and lease violation record. The previous building owner had documented every late payment, bounce check, and request for lease modifications that reflected the practice's ongoing financial difficulties. According to the tenant records that were transferred with the building purchase, Pemberton Family Dentistry has a history of late rent payments, requests for lease modifications, and disputes about maintenance responsibilities, I said, watching Dr. Pemberton's face as I revealed information that he had assumed would remain private between him and the previous building owner. Ashley Chen was looking increasingly panicked as she realized that their financial difficulties were being exposed to someone who now had the authority to terminate their lease. The patients in the waiting room were witnessing the complete destruction of Dr. Pemberton's professional authority and dignity. The combination of financial problems, regulatory violations, and professional conduct issues creates a challenging situation for new building management. I continued, my tone remaining conversational, while systematically cataloging the reasons why Dr. Pemberton's lease might be problematic for continued renewal. Dr. Pemberton was clearly struggling to process the rapid escalation of his problems, from a simple misunderstanding about patient finances to a comprehensive threat to his business operations. His expensive practice was facing regulatory compliance costs, lease renewal uncertainty, and reputation damage that could affect his ability to attract and retain patients. Ms. Martinez, I'm sure we can resolve any concerns about lease compliance and building issues through normal business discussions, he said, his voice carrying the kind of forced optimism that people use when facing overwhelming problems they can't solve through normal means. I could see that he was still hoping to contain the damage from his earlier behavior by treating our current conversation as a separate business matter that could be resolved through routine landlord-tenant negotiations. His tone suggested that he believed professional courtesy and financial arrangements could overcome the personal conflicts he had created. Dr. Pemberton, I think the challenge is that your conduct today has raised questions about your judgment and professionalism that extend beyond simple business relationships, I replied, my tone becoming more serious as I began to address the broader implications of his behavior. My phone rang with Jennifer's distinctive ringtone, and I answered it immediately, understanding that her timing was likely related to urgent developments in the building management situation. Becca, I just received a call from the city building inspector, Jennifer said, her voice carrying the kind of urgency that indicated significant developments. He wants to schedule an immediate follow-up inspection of the dental office space because of the violations that were identified in our purchase inspection. I could see Dr. Pemberton trying to hear Jennifer's side of our conversation, clearly understanding that any communication with building inspectors could have immediate consequences for his practice operations. The inspector mentioned that the previous building owner had been avoiding enforcement actions, but new ownership triggers mandatory compliance reviews, Jennifer continued. If the violations aren't corrected within 30 days, the space will lose its certification for medical use. The 30-day timeline for compliance was much shorter than Dr. Pemberton had probably expected, and the threat of losing medical certification would effectively force closure of his practice if the violations weren't addressed quickly and expensively. Additionally, the inspector wants to review all tenant lease agreements to ensure that responsibility for building code compliance is clearly established, Jennifer added. He specifically mentioned concerns about dental office operations and whether current lease terms provide adequate protection for building owners. I could see Ashley Chen and Kevin Rodriguez exchanging worried glances as they understood that their employment might be affected by regulatory issues and lease problems that were beyond their control. The patients in the waiting room were witnessing the complete unraveling of what had appeared to be a successful and stable dental practice. I'll coordinate with the inspector to schedule the follow-up review, I told Jennifer, maintaining eye contact with Dr. Pemberton while discussing his professional future with someone who had the authority to affect his business operations. We should also review tenant responsibilities for compliance costs and determine whether current lease terms are adequate for new ownership requirements. When I ended the call, the waiting room was completely silent, except for the classical music that now seemed mockingly cheerful given the tension that had developed. Dr. Pemberton was staring at me with an expression that mixed fear, anger, and growing desperation. "Miss Martinez, surely you're not going to allow a simple misunderstanding about treatment options to affect legitimate business relationships," he said, his voice carrying pleading undertones that hadn't been present during his earlier confident assessments of my financial situation. I could see that he was finally beginning to understand that his arrogant behavior had created consequences that extended far beyond hurt feelings or damaged professional relationships. His expensive practice was facing regulatory compliance costs, lease renewal uncertainty, and potential closure if the building code violations weren't addressed according to the inspector's timeline. "Dr. Pemberton, I don't think this was a simple misunderstanding," I replied, my tone remaining professional, while making it clear that I wasn't going to minimize the significance of his conduct. "Your decision to publicly humiliate someone based on assumptions about their financial circumstances reveals a pattern of professional behavior that raises serious concerns about tenant relations." Ashley Chen was clearly calculating whether she should begin looking for alternative employment, understanding that workplace instability and potential practice closure could affect her job security. Kevin Rodriguez was quietly organizing his desk in ways that suggested he was preparing for possible disruption to normal business operations. "More importantly," I continued, "your response when challenged about that behavior has demonstrated a level of arrogance and disrespect that makes ongoing landlord-tenant relationships very challenging to maintain." Dr. Pemberton was beginning to show signs of genuine panic as he realized that his professional future was being determined by someone whose judgment and authority he had publicly questioned. His expensive lifestyle and business operations depended on maintaining his practice in a prestigious location, and alternative spaces in downtown Millbrook were limited and costly. "Ms. Martinez, I apologize for any offense caused by my comments about treatment options," he said, his voice carrying desperate sincerity as he attempted one final effort to minimize the consequences of his behavior. "I was simply trying to be helpful, and I clearly misunderstood your circumstances." I could see that he was hoping a direct apology might allow us to reset our relationship and proceed with normal business arrangements, despite the dramatic revelations about my actual financial status and property ownership. His tone suggested that he believed acknowledging his error might be sufficient to overcome the damage his conduct had created. But I wasn't interested in allowing Dr. Pemberton to escape the consequences of his arrogant assumptions through superficial apologies that didn't address the fundamental problems with his attitude and behavior. His public humiliation of me had been deliberate and unnecessary, and his defensive responses when challenged had revealed character flaws that made him problematic as a tenant. "Dr. Pemberton, your apology is noted, but I think we need to address more substantial issues about professional conduct, building compliance, and lease renewal terms," I said, my tone becoming more businesslike as I prepared to conclude this educational experience. The waiting room had become a silent audience for the complete reversal of power and authority that neither Dr. Pemberton nor his staff had anticipated when this conversation began. Ashley Chen was staring at her computer screen with the kind of focused attention people use when they're trying to process overwhelming information. Dr. Pemberton was clearly understanding that his expensive dental practice was now under the control of someone whose authority and financial resources he had publicly questioned, and that his professional future would depend on maintaining good relationships with someone he had treated with condescending disrespect. The next few minutes would determine whether he learned anything meaningful from this experience about the dangers of making assumptions about people based on appearances, or whether he would simply try to minimize the damage without understanding the broader lessons about respect and professional conduct that this situation was designed to teach. Either way, this conversation had demonstrated that treating people with arrogant assumptions about their circumstances could have consequences that extended far beyond simple embarrassment or damaged relationships, and that underestimating someone could be the most expensive mistake a professional ever made. The building inspector arrived exactly 48 hours after my conversation with Dr. Pemberton, and his presence in the Millbrook Professional Plaza created immediate chaos that rippled through every office in the building. Thomas Mitchell was a methodical man in his 50s who had been enforcing building codes in Millbrook for over 20 years, and his reputation for thoroughness made property owners nervous even under normal circumstances. I had arranged to meet Inspector Mitchell in the lobby before he began his comprehensive review of the dental office space, wanting to establish my role as the new building owner and ensure that he understood the regulatory priorities that came with new management. The previous owner had apparently maintained casual relationships with city officials that allowed certain violations to be overlooked indefinitely, but those arrangements ended when the property changed hands. Ms. Martinez, I appreciate you taking ownership of building compliance seriously, Inspector Mitchell said as we walked toward the elevator that would take us to Dr. Pemberton's office. The previous owner had a tendency to treat building codes as suggestions rather than requirements, which created significant safety and liability issues. His tone carried the professional frustration that comes from years of dealing with property owners who prioritized convenience over compliance. The violations he had identified during the purchase inspection were apparently representative of broader maintenance and safety issues that had been accumulating throughout the building. The dental office space has some of the most serious violations I've documented in recent years, Inspector Mitchell continued as we approached the second floor where Pemberton Family Dentistry operated. Electrical systems that don't meet current medical facility requirements, ventilation problems that could affect patient safety, and accessibility issues that violate federal regulations. I could hear the sounds of normal business operations coming from Dr. Pemberton's office, suggesting that he was continuing to see patients despite knowing that regulatory compliance issues were about to be formally addressed. The contrast between his public confidence and private desperation was becoming increasingly apparent. Dr. Pemberton has been notified about today's inspection, I told Inspector Mitchell as we approached the office entrance. Though I should mention that our initial discussions about compliance timelines and responsibility were somewhat challenging. Inspector Mitchell nodded with the kind of understanding that comes from dealing with difficult tenants who resist acknowledging regulatory violations. His experience had taught him that denial and deflection were common responses to building code enforcement, particularly from businesses that faced expensive compliance costs. The scene that greeted us when we entered the dental office was carefully orchestrated professional normalcy that couldn't quite hide the underlying tension. Ashley Chen was at her reception desk attempting to maintain routine appointment scheduling, but her nervous glances toward the door suggested that she had been anticipating our arrival with considerable anxiety. Dr. Pemberton emerged from a treatment room wearing his pristine white coat and displaying the kind of confident professionalism that he used to intimidate patients and staff. His smile was perfectly calibrated to suggest that he welcomed regulatory oversight as an opportunity to demonstrate his commitment to patient safety and professional excellence. Inspector Mitchell, thank you for accommodating our schedule, Dr. Pemberton said, extending his hand with the kind of firm handshake that successful professionals use to establish authority in business relationships. I'm confident that you'll find our facility meets all applicable safety and compliance requirements. His tone carried the assumption that this inspection would be a routine formality that would confirm his professional competence and resolve any minor technical issues through normal administrative processes. The confidence he projected suggested that he still didn't understand the serious nature of the violations that had been identified. Inspector Mitchell accepted the handshake with professional courtesy, but his expression remained focused and businesslike in ways that indicated this wouldn't be a superficial review designed to confirm existing assumptions about compliance. Dr. Pemberton, this inspection will be comprehensive and detailed, Inspector Mitchell replied, his tone carrying the authority that comes from years of enforcing regulations that protect public safety. The violations identified during the pre-purchase inspection require immediate attention, and new building ownership means that previous enforcement arrangements are no longer valid. I could see Dr. Pemberton's confident expression falter slightly, as he began to understand that Inspector Mitchell wasn't going to treat this as a routine administrative matter that could be resolved through professional courtesy and minimal compliance efforts. Of course, we want to address any concerns about facility safety, Dr. Pemberton said, though his voice carried undertones of uncertainty that hadn't been present during his initial greeting. Perhaps you could explain what specific issues need to be addressed. Inspector Mitchell opened his clipboard and extracted a detailed report that listed every violation identified during the previous inspection, along with regulatory citations and compliance requirements that would need to be satisfied to maintain medical facility certification. The electrical system serving your dental equipment doesn't meet current National Electrical Code requirements for medical facilities, Inspector Mitchell began, his tone remaining professional, while delivering information that was systematically dismantling Dr. Pemberton's assumptions about routine compliance. The wiring was installed 15 years ago under different standards, and current regulations require upgraded systems with enhanced safety features. Ashley Chen was listening to this conversation with obvious alarm, clearly understanding that electrical system upgrades would be expensive and disruptive to normal business operations. Kevin Rodriguez had emerged from his office area and was watching the inspection process with the kind of focused attention that people give to situations that might affect their employment. Additionally, the ventilation system doesn't provide adequate air exchange rates for medical facilities, Inspector Mitchell continued, checking items off his list as he explained each violation. Current regulations require specialized HVAC systems that prevent cross-contamination between treatment areas and maintain air quality standards that protect both patients and staff. Dr. Pemberton was beginning to show signs of genuine concern as he realized that the compliance issues weren't minor technical problems that could be addressed through simple repairs or administrative adjustments. The violations Inspector Mitchell was describing would require substantial renovations that could cost tens of thousands of dollars. The accessibility compliance issues are equally serious, Inspector Mitchell added, walking toward the treatment area to examine the physical layout of the office space. The current configuration doesn't meet Americans with Disabilities Act requirements for medical facilities, including door widths, bathroom accessibility, and patient accommodation features. I followed Inspector Mitchell and Dr. Pemberton through the office space, watching as each area was systematically evaluated against current building codes and safety regulations. The expensive equipment and luxury finishes that Dr. Pemberton used to intimidate patients couldn't disguise the underlying structural and systems problems that had been ignored under previous building management. Dr. Pemberton, these violations represent serious safety risks that could affect your professional liability and medical facility certification, Inspector Mitchell explained as he documented additional problems with emergency egress routes and fire safety systems. Current regulations require immediate compliance, and continued operation without addressing these issues could result in facility closure. The mention of potential facility closure created visible panic in Ashley Chen, who was clearly calculating the implications for her employment and financial security. Kevin Rodriguez was taking notes on the violations being identified, apparently understanding that documentation might be important for potential insurance claims or legal proceedings. Dr. Pemberton's professional composure was beginning to crack as he realized that the regulatory compliance issues were much more serious and expensive than he had anticipated. His expensive practice was facing forced closure if the violations weren't addressed quickly, but the cost of compliance might exceed his financial resources. Inspector Mitchell, surely there must be reasonable timelines for addressing these issues, Dr. Pemberton said, his voice carrying desperation that he was trying to disguise as professional concern for patient care continuity. Closing the practice would disrupt treatment for hundreds of patients who depend on our services. Inspector Mitchell's response was delivered with the kind of professional sympathy that regulatory officials use when explaining requirements that create hardship but cannot be waived for convenience. Dr. Pemberton, I understand that compliance costs can be challenging, but building codes exist to protect public safety, Inspector Mitchell replied. The violations in this facility have existed for years, and new building ownership means that enforcement deferrals are no longer possible. His tone made it clear that the compliance timeline would be determined by safety requirements rather than business convenience, and that continued operation without addressing the violations would not be permitted regardless of the financial or operational challenges involved. You have 30 days to complete all necessary upgrades and pass re-inspection, Inspector Mitchell continued, making notes on his clipboard that would become part of the official enforcement record. If compliance isn't achieved within that time frame, the space will lose its certification for medical use. The 30-day deadline was clearly much shorter than Dr. Pemberton had expected, and the threat of losing medical certification would effectively force closure of his practice if the expensive renovations weren't completed quickly. My phone buzzed with a text message from Jennifer, and I glanced at it while Inspector Mitchell continued his detailed examination of the office space. The message contained information that would make Dr. Pemberton's situation even more challenging than he was beginning to understand. Spoke with contractor about building code compliance costs. Electrical upgrade alone estimated at $45,000. HVAC system replacement $35,000. Accessibility modifications $25,000. Total compliance costs likely exceed $120,000. Timeline very tight for permits and inspections. I looked up from my phone to find Dr. Pemberton watching me with obvious anxiety, clearly understanding that any communication about building matters could affect his ability to continue operating his practice. The cost estimates Jennifer had provided would represent a financial crisis for a business that was already struggling with rent payments and cash flow problems. Dr. Pemberton, I just received some preliminary information about compliance costs that you should be aware of, I said, maintaining my professional tone, while delivering information that would further destabilize his already precarious situation. Inspector Mitchell paused his examination to listen to our conversation, clearly understanding that financial feasibility was often the determining factor in whether building code violations could be addressed within required timelines. My property management team has consulted with contractors about the renovations needed to address the violations Inspector Mitchell has identified, I continued, watching Dr. Pemberton's expression as I prepared to reveal cost estimates that would likely exceed his financial capabilities. Ashley Chen and Kevin Rodriguez were listening with obvious concern, understanding that expensive building renovations could affect their employer's ability to maintain normal business operations and continue paying salaries. The electrical system upgrades alone are estimated at $45,000, I said, seeing Dr. Pemberton's face go pale as he processed the magnitude of the financial commitment required for compliance. HVAC system replacement would cost approximately $35,000, and accessibility modifications would add another $25,000. The total compliance cost of over $100,000 represented a financial obligation that would be challenging for any small business, but potentially catastrophic for a practice that was already experiencing cash flow difficulties and struggling with rent payments. Ms. Martinez, surely those estimates are preliminary and could be reduced through competitive bidding, Dr. Pemberton said, his voice carrying the kind of desperate optimism that people use when facing overwhelming financial obligations they can't afford. Inspector Mitchell looked up from his documentation with an expression that suggested he had heard similar responses from many property owners who faced expensive compliance requirements. Dr. Pemberton, these cost estimates are actually quite reasonable for the scope of work required, Inspector Mitchell interjected, his tone carrying the authority that comes from years of overseeing similar renovation projects. Electrical and HVAC upgrades for medical facilities involve specialized requirements that typically cost more than standard commercial renovations. His assessment eliminated any hope Dr. Pemberton might have had that the compliance costs could be significantly reduced through negotiation or alternative approaches. The regulatory requirements were specific and non-negotiable, and the associated costs reflected the complexity of bringing an older facility up to current medical safety standards. Additionally, the 30-day timeline means that contractors will likely charge premium rates for expedited work, Inspector Mitchell added, making additional notes that would become part of the official enforcement record. Emergency compliance projects typically cost 15 to 20% more than routine renovations. The mention of premium costs for expedited work meant that Dr. Pemberton's total compliance obligation could easily exceed $130,000. A financial burden that would likely force closure of his practice, even if he could somehow secure financing for the renovations. Ashley Chen was clearly calculating the implications for her employment, understanding that her employer's financial crisis could result in immediate job loss regardless of her professional competence or workplace loyalty. Kevin Rodriguez was gathering important documents from his desk, apparently preparing for potential disruption to normal business operations. Dr. Pemberton, I think we need to discuss how these compliance requirements will affect your lease obligations and ability to maintain normal business operations, I said, my tone becoming more businesslike as we moved toward the practical implications of his regulatory and financial crisis. Inspector Mitchell was completing his documentation of the violations, and preparing to issue formal citations that would begin the official enforcement process. His presence had transformed Dr. Pemberton's compliance problems from abstract concerns into immediate legal and regulatory obligations, with specific deadlines and financial consequences. The lease agreement for this space includes tenant responsibility for maintaining building code compliance, I continued, watching Dr. Pemberton's expression as I explained lease terms that he had probably never read carefully. Failure to address regulatory violations within required timelines constitutes grounds for lease termination. The threat of lease termination added another layer of crisis to Dr. Pemberton's situation, since losing his prestigious downtown location would effectively destroy his ability to maintain the kind of upscale practice that generated enough revenue to support his expensive lifestyle and business operations. Ms. Martinez, surely we can discuss reasonable accommodation for compliance timelines, Dr. Pemberton said, his voice carrying pleading undertones that revealed how completely his professional confidence had been shattered by the cascading crises he was facing. I could see that he was hoping to negotiate extensions or modifications that would make his compliance obligations more manageable, but the regulatory requirements established by Inspector Mitchell weren't subject to landlord-tenant negotiations. Dr. Pemberton, the compliance timeline is determined by building code enforcement rather than lease agreements, I replied, maintaining my professional tone while making it clear that his regulatory obligations couldn't be modified through property management discussions. Inspector Mitchell was preparing to leave after completing his comprehensive examination of the office space and documenting every violation that required immediate attention. His official report would trigger the formal enforcement process that would determine whether Dr. Pemberton's practice could continue operating in its current location. Dr. Pemberton, you'll receive formal citation notices within 48 hours detailing each violation and the specific requirements for compliance, Inspector Mitchell said, gathering his equipment and preparing to conclude the inspection process. The 30-day timeline begins when you receive official notification. The formal citation process would create a public record of the violations that could affect Dr. Pemberton's professional reputation and ability to secure financing for the necessary renovations. Building code violations were matters of public record that could be accessed by patients, competitors, and professional organizations. Additionally, I'll be coordinating with the State Medical Facility Licensing Board to ensure they're aware of the compliance issues, Inspector Mitchell added, delivering information that expanded Dr. Pemberton's crisis beyond local building codes into professional licensing concerns. The involvement of state medical licensing authorities meant that Dr. Pemberton's regulatory problems could affect his ability to practice dentistry, even if he somehow resolved the building code violations. Professional licensing boards took facility safety violations seriously, and patterns of regulatory non-compliance could result in disciplinary action against his professional credentials. Ashley Chen was staring at her computer screen with the kind of focused attention people use when they're trying to process overwhelming information that threatens their employment security. Kevin Rodriguez was quietly organizing his personal belongings, apparently preparing for potential workplace closure. Dr. Pemberton was clearly struggling to comprehend the full scope of the crisis that had developed from what he had initially assumed would be routine building management under new ownership. His expensive practice was facing regulatory violations, financial obligations, lease termination threats, and professional licensing scrutiny that could collectively destroy his business operations. Inspector Mitchell, thank you for your thorough review, I said, maintaining my professional demeanor while internally satisfaction at seeing justice unfold through legitimate regulatory processes. I'll ensure that all compliance requirements are clearly communicated to the tenant. Inspector Mitchell nodded and shook my hand with the kind of respect that professionals show to property owners who take regulatory compliance seriously. His experience had taught him that responsible building management made his enforcement duties much more effective. After Inspector Mitchell left, the dental office was eerily quiet, except for the classical music that now seemed inappropriately cheerful given the magnitude of the crisis that Dr. Pemberton was facing. Ashley Chen was staring at appointment schedules that might become meaningless if the practice couldn't maintain its medical certification. Ms. Martinez, surely we can work together to find reasonable solutions to these compliance challenges, Dr. Pemberton said, his voice carrying desperate sincerity as he attempted one final effort to negotiate his way out of the regulatory and financial crisis. I could see that he was still hoping to convince me to provide assistance or accommodation that would make his compliance obligations more manageable. But the regulatory requirements established by Inspector Mitchell were beyond my authority to modify, even if I had been inclined to help him. Dr. Pemberton, the building code violations and compliance timeline are regulatory matters that can't be changed through landlord-tenant negotiations, I replied, my tone remaining professional while making it clear that his problems were beyond my ability or willingness to solve. My phone rang with Jennifer's distinctive ringtone, and I answered it immediately, understanding that her timing was likely related to developments in the regulatory enforcement process that would affect Dr. Pemberton's situation. Becca, I just received a call from the City Planning Department, Jennifer said, her voice carrying information that would make Dr. Pemberton's crisis even more complex. They're reviewing all current medical facility licenses in the Millbrook Professional Plaza because of the building code violations that were identified. I could see Dr. Pemberton trying to hear Jennifer's side of our conversation, clearly understanding that any communication with city officials could have immediate consequences for his ability to continue operating his practice. The planning department wants to ensure that all medical facilities in the building meet current safety and accessibility standards, Jennifer continued. They're particularly concerned about the dental office because of the number and severity of violations that were documented. The involvement of the city planning department meant that Dr. Pemberton's regulatory problems were expanding beyond building code enforcement into broader municipal oversight of medical facility operations. Additionally, the planning department received complaints from other tenants in the building about the dental office, Jennifer added, delivering information that revealed how Dr. Pemberton's problems were affecting other businesses in the Millbrook Professional Plaza. The mention of tenant complaints suggested that Dr. Pemberton's regulatory violations and associated renovation requirements were creating disruption that affected other professional practices in the building. Apparently, other tenants are concerned about potential liability issues and disruption to their business operations if the dental office can't maintain its medical certification, Jennifer explained. The accountant on the 3rd floor and the law firm on the 4th floor have both expressed concerns about being associated with a building that has medical facility compliance problems. I could see Ashley Chen and Kevin Rodriguez exchanging worried glances, as they understood that their employer's regulatory problems were creating broader consequences that affected the entire building's professional reputation. The planning department is scheduling individual meetings with all tenants to review their compliance status and discuss the implications of ongoing violations in the building, Jennifer continued. They want to ensure that Dr. Pemberton's problems don't create liability issues for other medical and professional practices. The prospect of individual compliance reviews for all tenants meant that Dr. Pemberton's violations had triggered broader regulatory scrutiny that could affect every business in the Millbrook Professional Plaza. When I ended the call, Dr. Pemberton was staring at me with complete desperation, finally understanding that his regulatory problems had escalated beyond his ability to control or contain through normal business negotiations. Ms. Martinez, what can I do to resolve these compliance issues and maintain normal business operations? He asked, his voice carrying the kind of defeated acceptance that comes when people finally understand that their problems are beyond their ability to solve independently. I looked at Dr. Pemberton standing in his expensive office surrounded by luxury equipment and prestigious professional credentials, facing regulatory violations, financial obligations, lease termination threats, and professional licensing scrutiny that would likely destroy everything he had built through years of arrogant assumptions about his authority and superiority. The contrast between his current desperation and the condescending confidence he had shown when publicly humiliating me for my supposed financial limitations was so complete that it almost seemed like poetic justice rather than simple regulatory enforcement. Dr. Pemberton, I think these compliance issues are beyond what normal landlord-tenant discussions can address, I replied, maintaining my professional tone while making it clear that his problems required solutions that I wasn't able or willing to provide. The next few days would determine whether Dr. Pemberton could somehow secure the financial resources and regulatory approvals needed to address his compliance violations, or whether his expensive practice would be forced to close because of regulatory requirements that he could no longer avoid through personal relationships and enforcement deferrals. Either way, this situation had demonstrated that making assumptions about people based on appearances could have consequences that extended far beyond simple embarrassment, and that treating others with arrogant disrespect could ultimately destroy everything that such behavior was intended to protect. 6 months after the building inspection that changed everything, I stood in my new corner office on the top floor of the Millbrook Professional Plaza, looking out over downtown Millbrook through floor-to-ceiling windows that provided a commanding view of the business district I was quietly transforming. The space had been completely renovated to serve as the headquarters for Martinez Property Holdings, reflecting both the success of my real estate investments and my decision to operate more openly as a significant force in Millbrook's commercial development. The transformation of my professional image had been gradual but deliberate. I still worked part-time at the library because I genuinely enjoyed helping people access information and resources. But I no longer felt compelled to hide my business achievements behind a facade of financial modesty. The respect I commanded as a successful real estate developer was earned through competence and strategic thinking rather than inherited assumptions about my circumstances. My office was designed to reflect authentic success rather than ostentatious display. The furniture was high quality but understated, chosen for functionality and comfort rather than intimidation. Original artwork from local artists decorated the walls, supporting the community while creating an environment that felt both professional and personally meaningful. The overall effect communicated competence and substance without the aggressive luxury that some business owners used to mask insecurity or inexperience. Jennifer Thompson had become not just my attorney but a trusted business partner whose expertise in commercial real estate law had been essential to expanding my property portfolio throughout Millbrook and the surrounding region. Our weekly strategy meetings were held in my new conference room, where we planned acquisitions and development projects that would continue building my influence in regional commercial real estate markets. "Becca, the downtown revitalization project is proceeding ahead of schedule," Jennifer reported during our latest meeting, spreading architectural plans across the conference table. "The City Planning Commission approved all our proposals for mixed-use development, and the tax incentive package will make the entire project even more profitable than we originally projected." The downtown revitalization project represented the culmination of 3 years of strategic property acquisitions that had positioned me to lead Millbrook's transformation from a declining small city into a thriving regional business center. My ownership of key commercial buildings had given me the influence necessary to coordinate development efforts and attract the kind of businesses that would create sustainable economic growth. The medical complex proposal has attracted interest from 3 different healthcare systems, Jennifer continued, pointing to plans for a state-of-the-art medical facility that would anchor the eastern section of downtown Millbrook. They're particularly impressed with the accessibility features and parking arrangements that will make the facility attractive to both patients and medical professionals. The medical complex was designed to provide exactly the kind of modern, code-compliant facilities that medical professionals needed to operate successful practices without the regulatory and infrastructure problems that had plagued older buildings like the Millbrook Professional Plaza. The contrast with Dr. Pemberton's former situation was intentional and satisfying. "Have you heard anything recent about Dr. Pemberton's situation?" I asked, though I already knew the general outlines of his continued difficulties from various sources throughout the Millbrook business community. Jennifer's expression became more serious as she prepared to update me on the consequences that had continued to unfold from Dr. Pemberton's regulatory violations and financial problems. The dental practice closed permanently 3 months ago when he couldn't secure financing for the building code compliance work. The space has been vacant since then, though we've had several inquiries from medical professionals interested in completely renovating it. The closure of Pemberton Family Dentistry had been both inevitable and dramatic. Dr. Pemberton had exhausted his financial resources attempting to address the most critical regulatory violations, but the scope and cost of necessary renovations had exceeded his ability to secure adequate financing. The 30-day compliance deadline had passed without resolution, resulting in immediate loss of medical facility certification and forced closure of his practice. "Dr. Pemberton filed for personal bankruptcy 2 weeks ago," Jennifer added, her tone carrying the professional neutrality that lawyers use when discussing the misfortunes of people who had created their own problems through poor judgment. The bankruptcy filing lists debts exceeding $400,000, including unpaid contractors, equipment loans, and penalty assessments from various regulatory agencies. The magnitude of Dr. Pemberton's financial collapse was staggering even by the standards of small business failures. His expensive lifestyle and leveraged business operations had created vulnerabilities that became catastrophic when his practice lost its ability to generate revenue through regulatory noncompliance. Ashley Chen found employment with the new dental practice that opened in the Riverside Medical Center. Jennifer continued, providing updates on the former staff members whose lives had been disrupted by Dr. Pemberton's poor decision-making. Kevin Rodriguez moved to Columbus and is working for a commercial property management company. The fact that Dr. Pemberton's former employees had found alternative employment was personally satisfying, since their professional competence hadn't been responsible for the regulatory and financial problems that destroyed their workplace. Ashley and Kevin had been caught in the consequences of their employer's arrogance and poor judgment, but they had recovered and moved on to better situations. Dr. Pemberton himself has been unable to find employment in dental practice because of the regulatory violations and professional licensing issues, Jennifer explained. The state dental board suspended his license pending resolution of the building code compliance problems, and the bankruptcy filing has created additional complications for professional reinstatement. The suspension of Dr. Pemberton's professional license represented the complete destruction of the career he had built through decades of education and practice development. His arrogant treatment of patients and regulatory authorities had cost him not just his business, but his ability to practice dentistry anywhere in Ohio. I heard through the legal community that he's been working part-time at a dental supply company in Toledo, Jennifer added, her tone suggesting that this represented a dramatic reduction in both income and professional status. Apparently, it's the only employment he could find that utilizes any of his dental knowledge without requiring an active professional license. The contrast between Dr. Pemberton's current situation and his former position as the owner of Millbrook's most prestigious dental practice was so complete that it seemed almost surreal. The man who had publicly humiliated me for my supposed financial limitations was now working part-time in dental supply sales while struggling with bankruptcy and professional license suspension. My phone buzzed with a message from David Park, the commercial property manager who handled day-to-day operations for my expanding portfolio of buildings throughout the region. His text contained information about the former dental office space that would complete the transformation of Dr. Pemberton's professional legacy. New tenant signed lease for former dental office space. Dr. Maria Gonzalez will open comprehensive family dental practice focused on affordable care and payment plan options. Grand opening scheduled for next month. The irony was perfect and intentional. Dr. Pemberton's former space would be occupied by a dental professional whose practice philosophy emphasized exactly the kind of patient-centered care and financial accommodation that he had conspicuously lacked. Dr. Gonzalez had specifically requested the space because she wanted to serve patients who had been underserved by the previous practice's focus on expensive treatments and financial exclusivity. Jennifer, Dr. Gonzalez has signed the lease for the former dental office, I said, sharing David's message with obvious satisfaction. Her practice philosophy emphasizes affordable care and respectful treatment for all patients regardless of their financial circumstances. Jennifer smiled with the kind of professional appreciation that lawyers show for particularly satisfying examples of poetic justice. That seems like exactly the kind of tenant that space deserves. Dr. Gonzalez has an excellent reputation for professional competence and ethical patient care. The renovation of the dental office space for Dr. Gonzalez's practice had required the same building code compliance work that Dr. Pemberton had been unable to afford. But Martinez Property Holdings had incorporated those costs into the lease terms as part of our commitment to maintaining safe and modern medical facilities. The investment would be recovered through higher quality tenants and improved building reputation. The renovation work also resolved all the building code violations that had been identified throughout the Millbrook Professional Plaza, Jennifer added. Inspector Mitchell was particularly complimentary about our commitment to exceeding compliance requirements rather than doing the minimum necessary work. The comprehensive building renovations had cost nearly $200,000, but they had transformed the Millbrook Professional Plaza into one of the most sought-after professional office buildings in the region. The investment had increased both rental income and property value while eliminating the regulatory problems that had plagued the building under previous ownership. My decision to exceed building code requirements rather than pursue minimal compliance had been both strategic and philosophical. I wanted to demonstrate that responsible property ownership created value for tenants, clients, and the broader community, rather than simply extracting maximum profit through cost-cutting and regulatory avoidance. The other tenants in the building have been extremely positive about the improvements, Jennifer continued. The law firm on the 4th floor renewed their lease 2 years early because they're so pleased with the building management and facility upgrades. The contrast between my property management philosophy and Dr. Pemberton's approach to professional relationships was reflected in tenant satisfaction and retention rates that exceeded industry standards. Treating people with respect and investing in quality infrastructure created loyalty and stability that generated better long-term financial results than exploitative short-term thinking. My phone rang with a call from the Millbrook Chamber of Commerce, and I answered it immediately since I had recently been elected to their board of directors as recognition of my growing influence in regional business development. Ms. Martinez, this is Carol Stevens from the Chamber. I wanted to personally invite you to speak at next month's Business Leadership Forum about your success in downtown revitalization and responsible property development. The invitation to speak at the Chamber's Leadership Forum represented official recognition of my transformation from anonymous library worker to acknowledged business leader whose expertise was valued by the broader professional community. The respect I now commanded was earned through demonstrated competence rather than inherited assumptions about my circumstances. The forum audience will include business owners, city officials, and development professionals who are interested in learning from your approach to community-focused commercial development. Carol continued. Your work with the Downtown Revitalization Project has become a model for other small cities throughout Ohio. The opportunity to share my business philosophy and development strategies with regional leaders was both personally satisfying and professionally valuable. My approach to real estate investment emphasized long-term community benefit rather than short-term profit extraction, and the success of that philosophy was attracting attention from business leaders and municipal officials throughout the region. I'd be honored to participate in the leadership forum, I replied, understanding that public speaking opportunities would enhance both my professional reputation and my ability to influence regional development policies. I think there are important lessons about the value of treating business relationships as partnerships, rather than opportunities for exploitation. After ending the call, I reflected on the complete transformation of my circumstances and community standing that had occurred since that humiliating morning in Dr. Pemberton's dental office. The woman who had been publicly embarrassed for her supposed financial limitations was now being invited to share business leadership insights with regional development professionals. The change hadn't been achieved through revenge or manipulation, but through strategic decisions to reveal my actual capabilities and invest in community development that created value for everyone involved. My success was built on competence, ethical conduct, and long-term thinking, rather than the kind of extractive arrogance that had characterized Dr. Pemberton's approach to professional relationships. Jennifer was gathering her materials as our meeting concluded, but she paused to make an observation that captured the broader significance of what had occurred over the past 6 months. Becca, what's most impressive about your success isn't just the financial results, but the way you've maintained your values while building significant business influence, she said. A lot of people in your position would have been tempted to use their power vindictively, but you focused on creating positive outcomes for the community. Her comment reflected something I had learned about the difference between authentic power and the kind of superficial authority that Dr. Pemberton had exercised through intimidation and status symbols. Real influence came from creating value for others and building relationships based on mutual respect rather than fear or dependency. Dr. Pemberton's downfall was entirely self-inflicted, I replied. The regulatory violations, financial problems, and professional license suspension were all consequences of his own choices and conduct. I didn't need to do anything vindictive because justice occurred naturally through legitimate processes. The satisfaction I felt about Dr. Pemberton's situation wasn't based on revenge, but on the recognition that accountability had been achieved through proper channels that protected other people from similar treatment. His arrogant assumptions about patients' financial circumstances and his disregard for regulatory compliance had created vulnerabilities that eventually destroyed everything he had tried to protect through such behavior. My grandmother Elena had been right about the strategic value of being underestimated, But she had also taught me that genuine power came from competence and ethical conduct rather than deception or manipulation. My success in real estate development was built on legitimate expertise and community investment, rather than exploiting other people's weaknesses or circumstances. The view from my office windows encompassed most of downtown Millbrook, including the locations where I had strategically acquired properties that would anchor the community's economic development for decades to come. The responsibility that came with such influence was something I took seriously, understanding that my decisions would affect hundreds of families and businesses throughout the region. As I prepared to leave the office for my part-time shift at the library, I reflected on the lessons that Dr. Pemberton's situation had taught me about the importance of treating everyone with dignity and respect regardless of their apparent circumstances. The assumptions he had made about my financial limitations had revealed character flaws that ultimately destroyed his professional career and personal security. The library work that had once been my cover for real estate investments had become a meaningful way to stay connected with community members who might not otherwise have access to the kind of resources and opportunities that my business success had provided. Helping people find information, resources, and solutions to their problems was personally fulfilling in ways that pure profit generation couldn't match. Dr. Pemberton had assumed that working at the library indicated financial inadequacy, but the position actually provided insights into community needs and priorities that informed my property development decisions. Understanding what people actually needed from their business and residential environments made me a more effective developer than focusing exclusively on profit maximization. The drive home from my office took me past the Millbrook Professional Plaza, where I could see construction workers completing the final details of Dr. Gonzalez's dental office renovation. The space that had once housed arrogant assumptions about patient worthiness would soon provide compassionate dental care focused on treating everyone with dignity and respect. The contrast between Dr. Gonzalez's patient-centered approach and Dr. Pemberton's financially discriminatory practices represented more than just different business philosophies. It demonstrated that professional success could be achieved through ethical conduct and community service, rather than exploitation and intimidation. My apartment in Riverside Gardens remained my primary residence, though I had upgraded to a larger unit with better amenities as my financial circumstances became more comfortable. I chose to stay in the complex because the location was convenient and the community was genuinely supportive rather than superficially status-conscious. The neighbors who had once viewed me as a struggling single woman working part-time at the library now understood that my modest lifestyle reflected personal choice rather than financial necessity. Their respect was based on my actual achievements and community contributions rather than assumptions about my economic circumstances. The evening news included a brief segment about Dr. Pemberton's bankruptcy filing and the permanent closure of his dental practice, describing it as an example of how regulatory compliance problems could destroy small businesses that failed to maintain proper safety standards. The report emphasized the importance of building code compliance for medical facilities without mentioning the personal conduct issues that had contributed to his downfall. Watching the news coverage of Dr. Pemberton's situation, I felt a sense of closure about the incident that had transformed both our lives in such dramatically different directions. His public humiliation of me had triggered a series of events that revealed his professional and financial vulnerabilities, while creating opportunities for me to demonstrate my actual capabilities and community value. The lesson wasn't about revenge or vindication, but about the importance of treating everyone with respect and dignity regardless of their apparent circumstances. Dr. Pemberton's assumptions about my financial limitations had been based on superficial observations that missed the reality of my situation, and his conduct had revealed character flaws that ultimately made him unsuitable for professional leadership. My success in real estate development and community influence had been achieved through competence, ethical conduct, and strategic thinking rather than manipulation or exploitation. The respect I now commanded was earned through demonstrated value rather than inherited assumptions about my circumstances. The story that had begun with public humiliation in a dental office waiting room had evolved into a comprehensive demonstration that appearances could be deceiving, and that treating people with arrogant assumptions about their worth could have consequences that extended far beyond simple embarrassment. Dr. Pemberton had learned, too late, that underestimating someone could be the most expensive mistake a professional ever made. His condescending treatment of patients and regulatory authorities had cost him his business, his professional license, and his financial security. Meanwhile, the quiet woman from the library had become one of Millbrook's most influential business leaders, using her success to create opportunities for others and improve the community for everyone. The transformation had been achieved through authentic competence rather than superficial status symbols, demonstrating that real power came from creating value rather than extracting it from others. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.